Welcome to the Alexander Blewett III School of Law and the 2022 Browning Symposium. I'm Elaine Gagliardi, the Interim Dean of the Law School, and we are delighted that you have joined us for a discussion on Montana's Constitution, the next 50 years. As we begin the symposium, I want to read the law school's land acknowledgment. This law school is on the traditional lands of indigenous peoples, including the Salis, Xanca, and Gillespie. Many others, including Blackfeet, Nez Perce, Shoshone, Bannock, and Coeur d'Alene, had and continue to have a crucial presence in the area. We acknowledge the role the legal system has played in the removal of indigenous people from these lands. And through our commitment to education, service, and scholarship, strive to improve the quality of justice for future generations. Doing so demands respect for tribal sovereignty and indigenous cultures, as well as accountability to the needs and perspectives of indigenous peoples, who from time immemorial to the present and until the end of time, protect and remain connected with this land on which we gather, live, learn, and work. This symposium is named for the Honorable James R. Browning. He was the longest-serving Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. I was fortunate to begin my legal career as one of his law clerks at the time he was chief. 3 words best describe Judge Browning: leader, communicator, and innovator. The Ninth Circuit doubled in size under his leadership, and he instituted the first computerized docketing system in any federal court. As a University of Montana law student, he was no different. Judge Browning was one of the founding members of the Montana Law Review and ultimately served as its editor-in-chief. I learned many things from the judge. He taught me the importance of a positive attitude. Judge Browning believed he could accomplish whatever he set out to do, and he did. He taught me the importance of a smile. The judge always had a ready smile to immediately make you feel comfortable and at ease in his presence. In fact, to him, this was the essence of being a Montanan. Of the importance of communicating and listening, I remember reaching out to all involved to get the opinions of everyone before making decisions impacting court administration as the circuit was growing. And most importantly, of being fair and resisting personal bias. I think we need to...
We like hearing you twice.
I thought I was the only one hearing that. I love having an echo. That way you don't miss what I said at all. In remembering Judge Browning, I just want to refer to something Justice Kennedy said as he recalled the judge. Judge Browning's smile was the smile of one who was immensely proud to dedicate his life to public service and to being a fair-minded man and a mentor to all with whom he served. Judge Browning would be proud to see his legacy continue. I want to thank the editors-in-chief of the Montana Law Review, Ben McKee and Eric Monroe, the symposium editors, Blake Comans and Lauren O'Neill, and the dedicated board and staff of the Montana Law Review for all of their hard work in bringing an outstanding group of speakers to our law school to continue the discussion on the Montana Constitution. At this time, it is now my honor to introduce to you another Montanan who I've had the privilege of working with. at the other end of my legal career. And he, like Judge Browning, is a leader, a communicator, and an innovator. Please join me in welcoming the President of the University of Montana, Seth Bodner.
Well, thank you, Dean Gagliardi, and thank you, everyone, for being here. It is really exciting to be here at this event and to really celebrate and discuss really a fantastic document. That's the Montana State Constitution. Now, as we talk about the past and the present and the future of this great state, I appreciate Dean Gagliardi's acknowledgement that our university does sit on the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people, and our law school does live out that acknowledgement. A great example is the Marjorie Hunter Brown Indian Law Clinic that has for over 40 years been providing students with practical experience on Indian law issues, and we're humbled to be partners in this culturally rich and critically important work. I also want to start by thanking the many distinguished guests joining us for this event. I want to especially thank the Montana Law Review team for their incredible hard work organizing this symposium. Our UM Law students, in very real ways, shape Montana. And I'm both proud of and grateful for their deep commitment to our great state. So thank you to the Law Review team for putting this together. Tonight, as you look at our panel, you'll hear from a delegate to the 1972 Constitutional Convention, a renowned journalist, a researcher on the Bill of Rights Committee at the 1972 Convention, a former justice of the Montana Supreme Court, a state civil servant, a leader, a legislator. This is an impressive panel. And tomorrow we have more impressive guests, a chief judge from the U.S. Court of Appeals, a former governor, numerous legal scholars, important community leaders. And it is wonderful to host such distinguished guests here at the University of Montana. Most important over these next couple of days is this group, and with the guidance of these distinguished guests, we're going to consider the importance of our state's constitution in the context of not just the past, but of the future of our state. And this is a really important conversation. Our very popular UM Law professor and recent nominee to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. You all know who I'm talking about, our good friend Anthony Johnstone. I'm going to quote him, and I cleared it with him beforehand to make sure it's okay if I quote you, right? That doesn't cause any issues in nomination processes. So you have to be careful during this period, and it's okay because he wrote this before any nomination. But I thought it was quite poignant, and he said that American democracy lives in the states. State constitutions structure our democratic practice from the bottom up and sustain today's most pressing debates affecting education, welfare, public finance, liberty, equality, criminal justice, judicial independence and accountability, and politics itself. Now, I, by no means, am a constitutional scholar, and so I will leave the rigorous discussion of our state's constitution and its future implications to the experts. However, I do want to touch on an important point, and that's the important role that the University of Montana and the Alexander Blewett III School of Law play in Montana legal and political communities, and frankly, the sustaining the health of our democracy, not just here in our state, but across the country. Since 1911, UM's law school has been educating Montanans for future service to this great state. And now many of those attending tonight and on our panels were educated right here at UM. I think we have 4 of our panelists who are educated at UM, Mainan, Chuck, and Shane, all UM grads. And as I learned, Justice Nelson's mom was educated as a UM alum. Is that correct?
Oh, my daughter graduated.
Your daughter, okay. Well, so you passed on that wise knowledge then. Thank you. But, and I, that makes me feel very proud because we see the impact of our alumni. And we recently learned over the last couple of days that the University of Montana was recently named the #1 school in the entire country, #1 university among all U.S. universities, including our top tier Ivy League institutions, you name it. #1 in the country, UM was ranked for community and national service. It's fantastic. And we'll be talking more about that. Our students are public servants, and it's wonderful to see national recognition of that fact. And I highlight this tonight because discussing our great state's Constitution is first and foremost a discussion about the health and importance of our democracy. And community and national service, something that embodies the very ethic of this university. That service, whether that service is through the ways our law students give back to the state of Montana, the way our students engage in military service, the way our students become civically and politically involved, both during their time here and after they graduate, that service and that commitment to public service sits at the very heart of a healthy democracy. And UM alumni embody that in so many different ways. I saw my great friend Senator Diane Sands. There she is, back in the back. As I've said to her many times, I'm kind of glad I wasn't president here when she was a student, because she was tough even back then. But she has made this university and she has made this great state so much better. And I could go around the room for 20 other people I've bumped into tonight. But I'm so honored to serve at this university and to have the important responsibility of shaping the future leaders of this community, of this state, of this country. Because frankly, the degree, we're celebrating 50 years of our Constitution, and the degree to which the next 50 years of our state constitution remain an exemplar of democracy depends in large part on the University of Montana and this School of Law. And so we are very proud of, and we take very seriously, the role that UM's law school has played and must continue to play in buoying Montana as a place for healthy civic engagement, debate, discussion of ideas, and sustaining our American democracy. This is core to our university's mission of fostering inclusive prosperity in our community. So in educating our law students, as in educating all of our students across all of our colleges, we know and we take note of every single day that we are shaping Montana's future citizens and Montana's future leaders. And so I want to thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you for this discussion. And I have the privilege of turning it over to one of those future leaders that we're talking about, and that is the Editor-in-Chief of the Montana Law Review, Ben McKee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Bodner. Hello, and thank you once again to all of you for joining us for the 2022 Honorable James R. Browning Symposium, Montana's Constitution, the Next 50 Years. My name is Ben McKee, and I'm one of the co-editors-in-chief of the Montana Law Review. It is truly my pleasure this evening to introduce our opening panel. From 1972 to 2022, the past and future of Montana's Constitution. It is also my honor to introduce the moderator of this panel, Dr. Robert Saldin. Dr. Saldin is the director of the Mansfield Center's Ethics and Public Affairs program and a professor of political science here at the University of Montana. He is a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C., the author of several books, including most recently, Never Trump, The Revolt of the Conservative Elites, and has also written extensively for a number of publications, including The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and The New Republic. Please join me in welcoming our moderator for our opening panel this evening, Dr. Robert Saldin.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Appreciate that. Great to be here. This year's symposium, obviously, is about the Montana Constitution, and I think it is altogether appropriate that that be the focus of the symposium this year. And part of the reason for that, obviously, is that this is a notable moment in the Constitution's history. It's the 50th anniversary. But I think it's also appropriate because at the same time as we've been marking that anniversary this year, and again here tonight, the golden anniversary, we also do it at a time when the Constitution's future has recently become a topic of much discussion in Montana's political circles. And there are some who would like to see the Constitution heavily revised or even scrapped altogether and replaced. Others, meanwhile, are very much in the process of trying to mobilize to support and defend the Constitution. So I think there's a good chance that in the coming months and the coming years that the Montana Constitution is going to be front and center, and we're going to be talking about it a lot. Now, tonight, we're going to do a bit of both looking back and looking forward. And to do that, the law review team, they have assembled what really is, I think, an all-star panel here. I'm going to introduce each of them in turn. They'll come up, make some remarks, or I guess we're going to stay seated, right? They'll make their remarks from there, and then at the end of the session, there should be some time for Q&A. So leading us off tonight is going to be Chuck Johnson down at the end. Chuck, of course, is a longtime Montana political journalist and State House reporter. Over a 45-year career, Chuck, if I have this right, covered a remarkable 22 legislative sessions, 8 governors, 9 U.S. senators, and 10 U.S. House representatives. He started right here in town at the Missoulian before going to Helena, where he held positions in the Lee Newspaper's State House Bureau and the Great Falls Tribune's Capitol Bureau. Notably, one of Chuck's very first assignments, fresh out of UM's journalism school, was to cover the Constitutional Convention for the Associated Press. And he'll be obviously speaking about that tonight, giving us a little bit of a sense of the broader milieu in which the ConCon was held, both here in Montana and nationally. After Chuck, we'll be hearing from Maynan Ellingston. Maynan was elected to represent Missoula as a delegate at the Constitutional Convention. She was just 24 at the time, which made her the youngest delegate. She was also one of 19 women among the 100 delegates. But perhaps most notably, at least in my view, it's Maynan who, along with her fellow delegate Bob Campbell, Bob recently passed away. It was Maynan and Bob who wrote that iconic language in the preamble. That was their work. Maynan was subsequently recognized as one of the ConCon's 10 outstanding delegates. Since her service at the convention, she's earned a law degree here at the University of Montana, had a long legal career, most of it here in Missoula with Dorsey and Whitney. Tonight, she'll be talking about the ConCon's delegates, the ratification process that followed the convention, and the major changes from the old Constitution to the new 1972 Constitution. After that, we'll be hearing from Rick Applegate. Rick holds a BA and an MA from He was one of the very key central staff members at the Constitutional Convention. He worked as a research analyst for the Bill of Rights Committee, and it was as a result of his work on that committee that he developed lifelong friendships and relationships with some of the key architects of the Declaration of Rights, which he'll be talking about tonight. And these were some of the real luminaries of the convention: Wade DeHood, Bob Campbell, Dorothy Eck. Following Rick's service at the convention, he worked as a staff member in Congress. He worked in various capacities around the Northwest on a broad range of critical natural resource issues. Rick lives in Arizona now, but I think is kind of a testament to how much this document and the experience of the convention, how much that means to him. This is his second time back here to Montana in just a few months to reflect on the 50th anniversary. Following Rick, we'll hear from the Honorable James C. Nelson, who is a Vandal, a University of Idaho grad, earned his law degree at George Washington University in 1993 after being in private practice in Glacier County. Governor Mark Roscoe, who in fact is on the agenda tomorrow, I believe, appointed Jim to the Montana Supreme Court. He was later elected and re-elected to that seat and held it for nearly 20 years, retiring at the very end of 2012. This evening, Jim is going to address what he thinks the next 50 years may look like for the Constitution. And then finally, we'll be hearing from Senator Shane Mourgeot, who is another alum of UM Law School. He currently represents District 48 in the state Senate, which encompasses parts of the city of Missoula and then spreads west further into the county. Previously, he was in the state house for 2 terms, and notably, in his freshman term in the House, he assumed a leadership position, which is a pretty rare thing. He was minority whip. 2 years ago, he ran statewide as the Democratic nominee for state auditor. And Shane is also a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes and worked for a time as the tribe's in-house attorney. Tonight, he is going to be taking on a number of different tasks in responding to some of the things we've heard and reflecting as a member of one of those future generations on what he sees as some of the legacies of the Constitution, and again, kind of giving us a forward-looking perspective. So, with that, I will turn it over to Chuck.
Well, thanks a lot, Rob, and thanks for everyone for coming out tonight. A little about Montana's 1889 Constitution, which guided the state for really the majority of our history. For a territory to become a state, it had to pass a constitution. And in 1889, the powers that be tended to be the copper mining industries in Butte. The president of that convention was none other than William A. Clark, who later bribed the Montana legislature to get an appointment to the U.S. Senate. That document has been widely criticized as one that left Montana with a weak executive, weak legislative branch, and I think a weak judiciary. It was more just a quick document to become a state and serve the masters of the day. Montana was largely seen nationally as a colony of the Anaconda Company through much of its early history. Things started changing in the 1960s. The U.S. Supreme Court had several one-person, one-vote decisions. A critical one for Montana was Reynolds V Sims in 1965. It held that state legislative chambers had to be equally apportioned. Montana, like most every state, had a house that was based on population. The districts were based, each representative represented about the same number of people. The Senate, each county had one senator. So you had Yellowstone County, then the largest, with 80,000 people, with one senator, and Petroleum County with one senator. Its population was 800. So the legislature was predominantly controlled by rural interests, some Democratic, some Republican. With that decision, Governor Babcock said, well, that's not going to work for Montana. And immediately the next day, a woman from Butte sued. And her name was Phoebe Herwig. And she won in federal court, and the legislature was forced to come up with new districts. Things started changing in the legislature. One of the things that happened was the legislature studied the 1889 Constitution, the Legislative Council as it was known then, and they found that 20% needed revision, 32% needed repeal, and 48% was adequate. Well, it proceeded further on, and in 1970, the legislature put a call for the constitutional convention on the ballot in November, and 65% of the Montana public voting supported that. But some interesting things were happening in the 60s. First of all, you had the women's movement. You had a very active League of Women Voters, but also the AAUW, American Association of University Women. You had the business and professional women. You had student protests over the Vietnam War, civil rights movement nationally and to some extent in Montana. The first Earth Day was in April 1970. The voting age was lowered to 19 in a 1970 constitutional amendment that passed here. Labor unions remained strong. So you sort of had a bursting out of people that wanted to see change in the Constitution. A big one was the environmental movement. Of course, the Berkeley pit had acidic water. The Clark Fork was filled with toxins, sometimes flowed red. You had clear-cutting abuses in the Bitterroot National Forest. In Missoula, when I was in school, the air pollution problems when inversion set in were awful. It was described as a rotten egg smell. It was worse than that. Up and down the highways to the Flathead and down the Bitterroot were what they called teepee burners, small devices that sawmills used to burn their sawdust. And out in eastern Montana, the Nixon administration had the North Central Power Study, and it recommended 21 coal-fired burning plants in eastern Montana and similar numbers in Wyoming, and North Dakota, and South Dakota. So there was a real stirring up by the public to do something about it. So they put this on the ballot, and 2/3 supported, and a special election was called in November of 71 to elect delegates. People were enormously interested. There were 100 seats, 515 or 20 people filed from around the state. There was great enthusiasm. Well, at the same time, the legislature in 1971 was trying to deal with one of Montana's occasional revenue crises. And the Republicans, which controlled the House, wanted a sales tax. The Democrats, which controlled the Senate, didn't. And Governor Forrest Anderson, the Democratic governor, didn't. After 2 special sessions, they agreed to put it on the ballot. And so the choice was between a sales tax or a permanent increase of the surtax that was currently on the applied to income taxes. Well, it showed up on the ballot, and people rejected the sales tax 70% to 30%. And I'm convinced this was one reason the Democrats wound up with the big majority they did in the convention, because Democrats historically opposed a sales tax. And the previous legislative session in the House, the same districts were strongly controlled by Republicans. So they wound up with 58 Democrats, 36 Republicans, 6 independents. A secret to the Constitutional Convention success, in my opinion, was a Supreme Court decision in 1971 that held that current elected officials, legislators, county commissioners, mayors, could not run for the convention delegate seats because they would be holding 2 jobs, 2 elected posts simultaneously. This really irked legislators. I think they thought, well, we don't meet in even number of years, we'll come and write that Constitution. Well, it opened the door to a whole bunch of new people. Some had been legislators, some had been sheriffs, some had been county commissioners and mayors, but most had never run before. That doesn't mean they didn't know what was going on. They were good citizens of their community, active in groups like the League of Women Voters, active in their service clubs and the like. And so it really opened the door to a whole new bunch of leaders. I think but for that, it would have been the same old gang of the legislature, and we'd have seen a fairly weak Constitution. But this really made a big difference. And The grand total was 515 people ran, even some new reform candidates from Missoula, 32 independents, 232 Republicans, 247 Democrats. By occupation, there were 24 lawyers, 9 farmers and ranchers, 17 business people or merchants, 14 teachers or administrators, 11 who described themselves as homemakers or housewives. There were 4 clergymen, 2 bankers, a beekeeper who had a honeybee business, a radio DJ newsman who later attended law school here, a retired FBI agent and sheriff. And all in all, I think it was a pretty darn good mix for a constitutional convention. They came to Helena, and they made a couple really interesting decisions. And Maynan can probably elaborate on these, but they decided to seat alphabetically. If you've ever been to the legislature, you've got one party on one side, one on the other, like warring armies facing each other. And they also decided to share leadership. They divided the leadership post by party. They also divided each committee chair. Each party got chairs of so many, half the committees, and the other party got the other half. And the vice chairs were the opposite party. So they made a concerted effort to minimize partisanship. And delegates will tell you that they didn't even know what party people were from by the end of the session. Now, I don't want to touch on other people's talk, but I hope Shane will talk about this, but no Native Americans were elected. And that might be a good spot to... How am I doing for time, Rob? Is this...
Yeah, you got a few more minutes if you want them. Yeah.
Well, there had only been one Native American legislator in 1971. Part of the reason they weren't elected was we had what were called multi-member districts in the county. So today we have one of the major changes the convention delegates made was to establish single-member districts within a city, within a county. So a person literally could go door to door, meet every voter, and ask for his or her support. When it was countywide, it was very much difficult, and I think Native American candidates were penalized by not being able to have a very fair shot at those seats. So we got a completely different legislature or constitutional convention than we had in 1889 when it was the powers that be. This was a citizen convention, and Time magazine sent a reporter out, and he called it a people's crusade, and that's kind of what it was in a lot of ways. I'll stop there, Rob. That's okay.
Maynan.
Okay. I had a brief career of being a school teacher, 1 year. So I'm going to stand up just like I were still a school teacher. First of all, I want to thank the law school for having this. This is my 5th symposium on the Montana Constitution. And over the years, the number of delegates who would have attended this has dwindled significantly. There were 100, and now there are only 10. But I feel very fortunate, very lucky to be here to talk about this document. First of all, in addition to thanking the law school, the law review, I want to give kudos to Anthony Johnstone for this remarkable work of scholarship on the Montana Constitution. This was published just this year. He teaches constitutional law at this school. He is dedicated to the Constitution, to constitutional law, and what a remarkable contribution you've made, Anthony, to our state and to the Constitution. So thank you. It's a big book. So following following up a little bit on the election to the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, as Chuck mentioned, there were to be 100 delegates, and Missoula County had 8 delegates, all elected at large. There were 64 people who vied for those 8 seats. And so not only was there the general election in November of 1971, there was a primary election in which Democrats, Republicans, and independents each nominated 8 candidates for those 8 seats. Just think about it today. I mean, if you were voting for the legislature, you had to keep track of the qualifications of 8 people that you could vote for the Constitutional Convention. We had a much stronger newspaper then than we do now. And the delegates were subjected to incredible grillings by labor unions, by the teachers' unions, by citizens groups, and by the university and by the press as to where they stood on various issues with respect to the Constitution. And ultimately, the Missoulian endorsed 8 candidates for those 8 seats here in Missoula. Fortunately, I was one of those elected. And one of the things that's pretty interesting, I think, about my election was the fact that I had only been in Missoula for 4 years. I was a student at the University of Montana, working on my graduate degree in political science, and my political science professor, Dr. Ellis Waldron, encouraged me to run. I had just turned 24, which was the minimum age for running, and he suggested that I run as a Republican because we ran as partisans. And that was not a stretch for me, because I grew up in Texas, and being a Texas Democrat was really not anything that anybody really wanted to brag about. So I was very happy to run as a Republican. And the thing that's remarkable, I think, about the Missoula delegation is we had the most balanced delegation of all of the delegates across the country. The state. We had 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, 4 women, 4 men. We had the oldest delegate, who was Lucille Spear, who was a retired documents librarian here at the university. And then I was the youngest delegate, just having made the age in June for the fall elections. It was a remarkable thing to be elected to something so incredible. But I really want to tell you a little bit about the makeup of how we did the state's business, and I think what distinguished it from the 1889 Constitution. The 1889 Constitution, as Chuck mentioned, it was not about building a document for the governance of the state of Montana. It was the ticket to statehood. That's all they cared about. And the people that were elected, they did not want to create a government that worked. They didn't want government meddling in their affairs. They created a weak executive, a weak legislature, a court that maybe they could control, but they did not want to create a document that worked for the state of Montana. That was a distinguishing feature of the delegates who gathered in 1972. They wanted to make a document that really worked for the governance of the state of Montana. Now, with respect to partisanship. Chuck mentioned we ran as partisans. There was one partisan caucus, and that was in the early days, and it was to determine who would be the leader, who would be the president of the convention. That's the only partisan caucus. The parties never took a position prior to the convention on what should be in a constitution. Consequently, there was no reason for parties to have a caucus. The parties were neutral as to what should be in the Constitution. And if there was a split of opinion, the split was really more, as Chuck mentioned, the urban area versus the rural area. And yes, early on, first day, actually, we decided that we should seat ourselves alphabetically. And one of the things that played pretty heavily into that was the fact that there were 6 independents. And they said, well, if you seat yourselves, Republicans on one side, Democrats on the other, where are we going to be? And once, they made George Harper, the minister from Helena, made that point so clearly, it became clear that there was no reason not to seat ourselves alphabetically. Now, a little bit about how we went about writing a constitution. Obviously, none of us had any experience in writing a constitution, but the University of Montana, MSU, the law school, under the auspices of the Montana Constitutional Revision Commission, had brought about an incredible array of research analysts, including Rick and others, who prepared all of these documents about constitution writing and about what should be in constitutions. And there were a number of other states at about the same time that were considering writing their constitution, because there was a good government movement going on at the time. You may have heard of something called Common Cause by a guy headed by John Gardner, and he was all in favor of trying to open up government to people. And so there was a lot of research, there was a lot of activity, there was a lot of interest. And I'll tell you, these 100 people, when they hit the ground running, they were pretty informed about what should be in a constitution and what shouldn't be in a constitution. And there was pretty general agreement that a constitution should set out the basic parameters of government, how a government should be organized. And with respect to some of that, we didn't do anything remarkable. We had separation of powers, 3 branches of government. There was only one other state at the time with respect to their legislative branch that had anything other than a bicameral legislature. And there were some of our people on the legislative committee who thought, well, we're sitting here as a unicameral body. This Constitutional Convention is a unicameral body. Why do we need 2 separate legislative branches, the House and the Senate? So there was a real push to be innovative in that respect. But generally, with respect to the basic contours of government, 3 branches, here's where we really departed from other constitutions. We have, and I'm not going to take Rick's thunder on this, but we have the strongest Bill of Rights or Declaration of Rights of any state. Now, as you know, we have a Bill of Rights in the federal Constitution, but that was added after the delegates had written the Constitution, but they knew it would not be passed by the voters if there were not constraints on the power of government. We've been benefited from that knowledge, and we knew from the very beginning that a strong declaration of rights, that is the area of rights preserved to citizens where government cannot interfere, was the key thing that we had to create in this Constitution. And Rip will talk about that. We didn't take out any rights that were in the 1889 Constitution, but we added a lot of new rights, which he will talk about. I want to talk a little bit about how we operated. We were in committees. We were based on the articles of a Constitution. So we had Bill of Rights, the Legislature, the Executive, Revenue and Taxation, Education, General Government, the Judiciary. Every delegate got their first committee choice. Every committee met in open public session. There were no closed meetings of any committee or of the full body itself. Citizens were able to make proposals about what they wanted to see in this Constitution. And it won't surprise you to know that the most fundamental principle of this entire Constitution is we, the people. And I'm going to just take a segue in honor of my fellow Missoulian delegate and just read the preamble, because it's going to set the stage for a few other things I will talk about. We, the people of Montana, grateful to God for the quiet beauty of our state, the grandeur of our mountains, the vastness of our rolling plains, and desiring to improve the quality of life, equality of opportunity, and to secure the blessings of liberty for this and future generations, do ordain and establish this Constitution. I believe to this day that there is no document that is more rooted in we the people than this document. And I'll give you just a few examples. One, popular sovereignty is one of the most key provisions of this Constitution. Second, it acknowledges that all power derives from the people of Montana. Three, it makes it absolutely clear and essential that every citizen has the right to participate in government at every single level. Local government, school boards, the legislature, its committees. A drastic change from what had been before 1972, where the legislature had closed executive meetings. There were no roll call votes. Citizens could not figure out how or why their elected officials voted in any way. Other ways in which the rights of the citizens is paramount, we have a strong right of initiative. Citizens can, by petition, enact laws where the legislature has not been responsive. We've recently seen that with respect to legalization of marijuana. The legislature wasn't responsive. The citizens took that. They can propose, citizens can propose amendments to the Constitution. In the final analysis, every single change that is made to this Constitution has to be approved by the voters of this state. Now, there was no question about any of that with respect to the Constitutional Convention. Where there were questions were issues that I will just briefly talk about, and I'm going to highlight the big changes. And how am I doing for time?
1 more minute.
What? No. has three. Oh my God. Okay.
Couple more minutes.
2 more minutes. Okay. The really big changes in this Constitution, separate and apart from the Declaration of Rights. Legislature, we provided for Reapportionment Commission. Prior to that, the legislature fought, they gerrymandered, they carved out their own districts. We changed that by having an independent commission, single-member districts. Jeanette Rankin came to this convention at the age of 92 and spoke to the delegates and encouraged us, if we didn't do anything else, to do single-member districts. We did that. Big change. Other changes that are so key. The Natural Resources article of our Constitution, which required reclamation of land disturbed by mining. We had vast open pits across the state where there was no obligation whatsoever to reclaim those lands. Another key provision, we declared water for the first time to belong to the state of Montana. Prior to 1972, water records were in shoeboxes everywhere. Taxation. We required there be equalization of taxation. What was happening before 1972? We had local property assessment, and if you knew and if you contributed to the local elected county assessor, it's quite likely that your property would be valued at significantly less than the value across the state or maybe even your neighbor. And what the result of that was, by keeping assessments low, they got more state money for education. But even with that, we had a huge disparity in the amount of money we were spending on education across the state. Are you about ready to? I think he's about ready to dong me down, but
I'm not going to cut you off, Mayman.
okay, but those I think are probably. There's so many things that are significant improvements over our over the 1889 Constitution. But I want to tell you the most amazing thing at the end of this 54 days. We had 60 days to write this document. We finished it in 54. We came in under budget, and on that last day, every single 100 delegates went up and signed this document. We were worried that maybe one or two would not, but they all signed the document. And then after we adjourned, we had almost 2 months till June 6th to try to convince the voters to approve this Constitution. And I think it's really important, even though I'm going to go over my time, that voters were given this document. This is from 1972, and it was mailed to every single voter, and it explained the new Constitution. The new Constitution is in here. It explained the differences between it and the old Constitution, and it also showed the ballot that people would use to vote for this convention or for the Constitution. And I think it's really instructive because, particularly those of you who are law students, you're going to really learn the importance of words and precision in wording. And I'm going to just try to find this ballot if I can. It's getting kind of shop worn after all these years. Okay, so we were bold at the convention, but we weren't too bold. A majority of the people wanted to abolish the death penalty, but we thought if we abolished the death penalty, the Constitution could very well go down. There was a huge amount of support for gambling, but there was likewise a big opposition to gambling. So we didn't know what to do about that. If we were afraid if we put gambling in, it might go down. If we didn't put gambling in, it might go down. And then we also weren't sure about doing the unicameral legislature. So what we did is that we submitted to the voters 3 side issues. 1, gambling or no gambling. 2, death penalty or no death penalty. And 3, unicameral legislature. So everybody got this sample ballot just like this, and it said the 3 alternative issues do not affect the present Constitution. If adopted by a majority of those voting at the election, they will become effective only if the proposed Constitution is adopted. The voter should vote on all 4 questions, regardless of whether he votes for or against the proposed Constitution. So, on June 6th, by a vote of 2,500 people, the Constitution passed. There was an immediate lawsuit. No, it didn't pass. It didn't pass, even though the votes were there in favor of it. Here's what happened. And I'm sure there are people here from Butte, and I'm going to make fun of them. But here's exactly what happened. Butte voters voted 74% in favor of gambling. But they only voted 43% in favor of the Constitution. So the question became, well, did it pass or not? I mean, it passed by the number of people voting, right, on the question, but it didn't pass by a majority of the people that showed up to vote at the election. So another lawsuit, and it went to court. And the Montana Supreme Court said, yes, it was approved by a majority of those voting on the question of the Constitution. And this ballot was really clear, and too bad if people couldn't read it properly. So they didn't say that. I'm editorializing that a little bit. That decision was appealed to the federal district court, and the court said, yes, it passed. And then that decision was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court said it passed. So it passed by a really small margin. And to me, always, as being a bond lawyer, the election is really precision in language. Did it pass by a majority of those voting at the election? Did it pass by a majority of those voting on the question? Now, even though that was such a narrow margin, and I will end with this, I promise, this Constitution provides that every 20 years, the question of having another constitutional convention is submitted to the voters. So it was submitted to the voters in 1990, and by a very significant margin, like 85%, said we do not want another constitutional convention. It was submitted again in 2010. The margin was a little narrower then, but still, a significant majority said no, we do not favor calling for another constitutional convention. This will automatically be submitted to the voters of Montana in 2030. So the future generations, or the now generations, way past us, who built this document 50 years ago, we have built in an opportunity for every generation to take a look at this Constitution and to make sure it still works for Montana. I think it does, but we'll see. Thank you.
Thank you, May Nan. Rick Applegate.
You know, depending on how you want to do the math, the Constitution was ratified by something like 3,000 votes, or it was 2,500, or it was ratified by 1 vote.
3-2 state Supreme Court. And by the way, I love books. I'll confess I bought Professor John Stone's book, which I have touted a number of places. I bought it on Kindle so I could carry it around with me. But more importantly, I wanted to be able to highlight it very easily in different colors because I have a color code mind. And I have massacred that book on the Kindle. It looks like a rainbow that fell through the roof. It's very, very well done, and I'm delighted I don't have to answer the questions that he has at the end of the chapters. I escaped the University of Montana largely unnoticed in 3 years, but I was here during Diane Sand's time, and what I believe the president was intimating is true. There's a lot of stories to be told. Yesterday, I had the pleasure of speaking to a couple of the law school classes here, to a group of students who were markedly younger than I am, and they tolerated me reasonably well, I think. Tonight, with this panel, it feels comfortable. It feels like the old days. A long time ago, but in the words of, how many of you remember the Mission Mountain Wood Band? Became Montana Band. Of our days, we are never long gone, I guess. And as they would also say back then, given the way we arrived with a legislature that was upset about not being able to occupy the seats, we sort of came in without knocking. So just a quick nod to them. They were always around here near Aber and up the Gallatin at Bucks T4 pretty regularly. I was hired age 21, fairly quickly turned 22, and that didn't affect my work hours. Wade DeHood at one point said that I was doing the research for 2 years before the delegates arrived. My God, I wish that was true. I had 7 months, and there were other researchers who were hired a little later than I was, had less time. And I wrote 420 pages of text. It's the thickest of the research reports, weighs the most. And I noted in it that the reader was left to, not in that, but in a law review article, the reader was left at the end of that to stagger into what was called the selected bibliography. And a number of delegates said they'd read the whole thing. A number of others didn't say anything about that. In the course of our research, we were supervised by a commission. Highly esteemed Montanans were on it. There was a Blewett at the head. Marjorie Brown was involved. Ty Robinson, and Maine Anne's Prof. Ellis Waldron, and a number of others. And they didn't jump all over us. They read the material. It was clear they had read it, and they guided us to make sure we were laying out the issues fairly. And in my case, I tried to identify as many as I could that I thought might make it into certainly the deliberations of the committee and the convention, potentially into the Constitution. And I'll claim that's why it was so thick. Article 2 is the Bill of Rights, of course, in the Montana Constitution. I heard a distinguished professor indicate that some 30 states put their Bill of Rights as Article 1, and there were 3 that used Article 2. I don't think it matters where it is. There is a lot to it. The committee, when they arrived, obviously, as Maine Anne said, they were intentionally bipartisan, and partisanship disappeared. Principles continued. There were some good, strenuous debates. But Bob Campbell and George James, who was postman right across the street from where I grew up in Libby. Dorothy Eck, I remember her coming into my office, and we had a nice conversation. And when she got ready to leave, she said, you sound like you're kind of a progressive and a populist. And I said, well, okay. I didn't really know how to react. She said, that's good, and walked out the door. Different circumstance when Wade DeHood walked in. How many of you knew him in his life? Quite a few. I miss him a lot, always will. He was a Republican, and when he came into the room, he didn't immediately sit down. He just started explaining to me a few things he thought were important. And for a half an hour, I listened to an awful lot about the Ashcroft decision. And for those of you who know about the third liability case that we ended up writing into the Bill of Rights, it's part of the speedy remedy provision. It takes up a fair bit of language, and we had a hard time writing it. But it was a case involving Montana Power. The Supreme Court ruled the wrong direction in his opinion, and he wanted that addressed, and it was. The delegates were outsized members. As indicated, they were fresh to the business in many cases, but not to issues, not to public service. They focused on actually 4 important categories of liberties, and I always like to mention this because one was obviously protections from governmental encroachments and intrusions, and it's often the most cited, and it's one of the most important, clearly. But in addition to that, there was the complicated business of protecting from majorities that quite often in our history, and still occasionally do, ignore or run roughshod over the rights of more vulnerable minorities of many kinds and persuasions. Third, it is increasingly important, as it was even then to some extent, to work on protections from private sector abuses and intrusions. And we got a little bit of work done on that. And fourth, and equally important, in some ways, maybe a little more important even, is to lay the foundations with political freedoms for effective citizenship. And that's a difficult thing to get your arms around, particularly in our times now. It was really unpredictable that we would end up with anything like we did. No one started with the assumption that we were going to achieve all of that. It was an unbelievable, in some cases a stunning outcome, with a number of new provisions, some of them even unique in the American constitutional experience. Among the key provisions, and I'm not going to go into all of them, Main Ann pointed out popular sovereignty and the governance provisions. And I got to tell you, when I started speaking with the delegates in our briefings, the committee, about political theory provisions, I saw a lot of eyes start to cross. But they came to understand the importance of the root of government coming from people, from the citizens of the state. And beyond that, they liked the notion of self-governance, where it was clear, together with sovereignty, that Montanans could adjust their form of government as they saw fit. And then there's one more sentence in those provisions that I think is important, that government exists for the common good, not for private interests, not for grifting or corruption, for the common good. Now, that phrase has a lot of definitions, but I think we have a pretty good idea. It doesn't just mean that you would respond periodically to the latest ideological whims that ripple through our polity. Popular sovereignty and self-governance are important. There's an outstanding inalienable rights section in the Bill of Rights, and that's where the clean and healthful environment shows up as kind of the first item, as it properly should. Without a clean and healthful environment, how do you have the possibility for existence? And the delegates took that to heart, and they actually put provisions in the Natural Resources article. But late in the game, after the Bill of Rights proposal, which did not have environmental provisions, went to the floor, Reverend Bill Burkhart rose to his feet and suggested, he thought, as long as we had the obligation provisions in the Natural Resources article, which was a hard-fought battle and an important prerequisite for this, that we should have an inalienable right. Well, Chairman DeHood, who was very nervous about citizen suits potentially disrupting the economy of his area and others around the state, stood, and we had talked about this on a number of occasions. Some of those were the conversations where I've described him gripping an arm and not letting go until you understood what he was saying, and preferably agreeing with him. I remember all those fondly, really I do. But in any case, he rose and he asked Reverend Burkhart, are you trying to expand citizen standing to sue beyond someone's direct, rather personal interest? And Reverend Burkhart said, well, I'm not an attorney, basically, and kind of demurred on the question. And Chairman Hood said, with that understanding, I have no objection. And that's how the inalienable right went into the Bill of Rights. Nobody else said a word at that point. The inalienable rights section also has the right to pursue the basic necessities of life, including health and safety. Now, health and safety is typically associated with workers' health and safety, but it was in here in a somewhat broader context. And pursuing basic necessities was not a guarantee that the state would provide basic necessities, but it provided citizens with the ability to pursue them. That's as far as we could take that provision. In the same section, there are also equal protection and non-discrimination provisions, and that's where the Equal Rights Amendment is. And the delegates on the floor, when the Bill of Rights Committee report was offered, made it clear they were not willing, they said, Rachel Mansfield read it, were not willing to wait for the federal government. Thank goodness for that. We wouldn't have it. And I've mentioned this before in different settings that last time I checked, the family integrity, family values in Montana have not been degraded after 50 years of the Equal Rights Amendment. And that was one of the strong arguments that slowed and eventually halted the effort to adopt a federal Equal Rights Amendment. Social origin and condition were also included, and I now know that there is at least one student here who is going to do some work on that, and it needs it. But the wording can be found. There are actually some articles written about it that I've perused a bit, and it's something worth paying some attention to. It has not received a lot of legal attention since it was put in. And most critically, the non-discrimination provision applies not just to government, but to private entities as well. And that's worth a hard look, and I'm sure will be developed even more in the years ahead. Then there's a provision that has a rather nebulous term that I think has a lot of promise. There's some debate about whether it's actually a right or more of a principle. The dignity of the human being is inviolable. And that was actually borrowed from the Puerto Rico Constitution. It's also a principle you can find in Europe and in other places. It's fairly commonly asserted, but in my reading, I don't find a lot of definition hung on it yet, and that's kind of a surprise. Well, then we come to those political freedom types of things that I mentioned, where you're trying to improve the opportunities for citizens who want to participate effectively, to expand their citizen involvement. The right of participation, folks are now entitled to expect that governmental agencies will provide reasonable opportunities to participate in deliberations prior to decisions. That's a provision that I had actually hoped would be self-executing, in a sense, like most matters of civil liberties. Near the end of the debate, I think it was, unfortunately, but I understand because it was a new and unique kind of provision, basically. The phrase was added that you have the right as provided by law. And one way to read that is you have the right if the legislature says so and says how much. But I've seen some other language in various judicial holdings that suggests that even in the case where you have a rights provision that is not self-executing, the courts may have a role in passing some judgment on the adequacy of what is done to implement the right. Along with the right of participation, of course, is what you really need to be effectively participating in government, and their deliberations is the right to know. And this was one of the most contentious, took up an awful lot of convention time, and involved a lot of interaction with citizens and the media. The media quite concerned, and for some good reasons, that the way we had written it with the right of privacy, the right to know versus the right of privacy, that we may be creating a right to know and then wiping it out with the right of privacy. Near the end of the game, Wade and I talked about this and some others, and we added a phrase that said you had the right to know unless the merit of individual privacy clearly exceeded. So it made it clear that the right to know was somewhat paramount, but if the demand of individual privacy clearly exceeded it, then you had to stop at that point. Now, the right to know discussion also had some influence on the legislative deliberations that Maynard mentioned. We spent some time with that committee, and I think the committee did a great service by constraining a rather unwilling legislature from continuing all of the practices they had for basically excluding people who were trying to figure out what they were up to. The right of privacy wasn't just connected to the right to know. There's a separate provision, obviously, and it's the right of individual privacy, not available to corporations, clearly established on the floor. And as many of you know, that's an issue that's currently pending before the state Supreme Court now, and a lot of the floor discussion on the right, where it was emphasized that that right was to be a matter of deliberation by the judiciary, not left primarily to the state legislature. That has some relevance in that case. The right of suffrage is specified. There's a separate suffrage section, but the right of suffrage, the right to vote, is not to be impeded. And as we know, there's an awful lot going on that sounds a lot like impeding, weighing on that right. I happen to believe it's important to ensure electoral integrity. But against that, it is clear that that needs to be done in a way that does not impair the ability of people to vote, particularly those who will have the most difficulty meeting various requirements. It seem, frankly, to be somewhat shaded to diminishing the opportunity to vote for people who will vote the wrong way, in the opinion of some. There's a provision on the right of persons, not adults. The committee rather gleefully abolished sovereign immunity, and has been pointed out by a number of others that they may not have understood some of the complexities of that. It was almost immediately changed at the next election, so that 2/3 of the legislature can make exceptions so that the state can still claim sovereign immunity. And then there's a long litany of procedural rights. There's a provision on unenumerated rights, like so many other constitutions, including the federal Constitution. And this is a provision that tends to be expressed a lot in speeches, but without a lot of detail. And there's a provision on benefits. To wrap, am I close? Good. Just to wrap quickly, I've predicted that the road ahead, generally, and here in Montana, but generally in the country, is a bumpy one. Not just from the threat of individual amendments or an unfriendly convention. It's very easy to amend state constitutions, and to do it in times of strong partisan divisions, in acrimonious circumstances, where we have a dominance of disinformation, distortion, and even untruthfulness, is a dangerous piece of business. And if that turns out to be the course we follow here in Montana, I hope that citizens rally and do not forget that all government is for the common good.
Thank you, Rick. Justice Nelson.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here and for showing your support for Montana's Constitution. And thank you for the Law Review for putting this symposium on. I'm going to start by saying I think we've been living in a constitutional Camelot for the last 50 years. And unfortunately, that could very well come to an end within the next 2 or 3 years. So my task here tonight is to go over several things, to talk about how the Constitution can be amended, the possibility of a constitutional convention in 2023, what's at issue, what are the dangers of that. So I'm going to talk about those things and finish up with just a little bit about what my vision of the Constitution needs to be for each of our citizens. And then I'm going to talk just very shortly about one of the things that I think the Constitution failed to do, and that is where it has given too much discretion to branches of government that don't need that discretion. So, how do we amend the Constitution? If you have one of those constitutions that was available when you came in the door, turn to Article 14 of the Constitution, and that specifies how the Constitution can be amended. In Section 1, it says that if the majority, or if the legislature has a supermajority, that's 2/3 of each houses, if it has that supermajority, and they're about, my understanding is, about 2 seats away from that this coming session. If the legislature has a supermajority, then they can call, put on the ballot a vote for whether there should be an unlimited constitutional convention, or whether the convention should be limited to revising, altering, or amending the Constitution in some fashion. So that's Section 1. In Section 2 of Article 14, the people can do the same thing. Of course, they don't have to have a supermajority, but there is some requirements in there for the number of qualified electors and districts and so forth that have to sign such a petition. So the people can do that. That's Section 2. Section 3, and Maynard mentioned this, the Constitution is subject to periodic submission to the voters every 20 years as to whether or not there should be a convention, an unlimited convention, or something less than that. And that will next be proposed to the voters in 2030. In Section 8 of Article 14, the legislature can propose an amendment by referendum to the people to be voted upon. Again, that requires a supermajority of electors. And then there's a process that we're probably all familiar with in Section 9, and this is the Citizens Initiative, or these CIs that you see on the ballots periodically. I might mention Section 9 of Article 14 is very, very simple. It basically says that people have a right to propose citizens' amendments to the Constitution, and the only requirements in that are, again, the number of electors and the number of districts that have to sign the petition, and then there's some housekeeping requirements about submission to the Secretary of State. I will tell you that House Bill 651 in the 2021 legislative session all but dissolved the CI process. It imposed so many burdens and so many hurdles on it, and imposed so much discretion in certain individuals that basically the Attorney General can kill the CI, and it can go no place. It's unbelievable. And I hope to God somebody challenges that in court for constitutional purposes. So that's the way the Constitution can be amended. It's all contained in Article 14, and it's a pretty simple process, as I think Rick Applegate has already indicated. So what's the possibility of a constitutional convention in 2023? I think it's very good. I think there's a very strong possibility that there will be some sort of a convention in 2023, especially if the legislature has the supermajority. And as I indicated, consensus is that they're about 2 seats away from having that in the next session. So what would it be like if there was an unlimited constitutional convention called? I don't know how many of you watch Shark Week, but if you have, you've probably seen a feeding frenzy. You know, there's blood and guts in the water, and the sharks are just ripping things to shreds. I think that's kind of what you might see if there's an unlimited constitutional convention called in the next session. Every legislator up there probably has some bone to pick with some section of the Constitution that he or she doesn't like because it takes away this or grants too much that. So let me just run through a few things which I think are going to be on the chopping block or could be on the chopping block. And let me make a comment here too. This is about the 6th or 7th one of these types of lectures, symposiums, sort of things that I've done since the first of this year. And I am absolutely dumbfounded to every group I speak about how little Montanans know about their own Constitution. And I'm not speaking to a hostile audience. I'm speaking to the choir in these things. And people just don't know the wonderful sort of Constitution that is the organic legal document of our state. They simply don't. And I'll say a little bit more about how I think that can be remedied. But just let me put that, what I'm going to say now, in context. So what's on the chopping block? Well, let's start with Article 2. Right to seek health and safety and happiness in all lawful ways. Probably on the chopping block. Clean and healthful environment, most assuredly is going to be on the chopping block. And by the way, I'm not making this stuff up. A lot of these have already been on the chopping block already, and the legislature has tried to diminish them. So clean and healthful environment, right to human dignity, probably gone. The right to discriminate, there's a provision in the Constitution that says you can't discriminate on the basis of religion. But if you watch what's happening in the cases coming out of the United States Supreme Court, you've seen a constant intertwining of sectarian doctrine and politics. Corporations have a limited right to practice their religion, whatever the hell that is. So in any way, I think you might be seeing maybe a lessening of that prohibition against discrimination on the basis of religion. You might see religion playing a greater chance or a greater role in a new constitution. Article 2, Section 8, right to participate in government. Article 2, Section 9, the right to know, that's already been, transparency in government is kind of an aspiration, not a right anymore. The right of individual privacy, that's going to be a big one. That's going to put a target right on the back of the Constitution, and of course over abortion and the Armstrong versus State decision, which guarantees Montana women at least the right to seek abortion services on the basis of their right of individual privacy in the Montana Constitution, notwithstanding the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court overruled Dobbs. So that's a big one. Right of individual suffrage, as I think Rick has already pointed out, that's already under attack. And this is one of the things that just boggles one's mind. Let me read you the language in Article 2, Section 13. I mean, nothing could be more straightforward and simple. It says, all elections shall be free and open, And no power, civil or military, and I think a civil power certainly includes the legislature, no power, civil or military, shall at any time, before, during, or after, at any time, interfere to prevent the free exercise of the right of suffrage. That's probably the strongest right of suffrage of any constitution in the United States. And yet, there's all sorts of bills in this last session of the legislature that have tried to diminish that right. So that's going to be under attack. It already is. Right of persons not adults. You know, people under 18, they have way too many rights. Right now, under our Constitution, they have all the rights that adults, unless the law enhances their rights. But that's probably not going to fly. There's probably certain rights of the accused in Section 24 that are going to be under attack. Unenumerated rights. That's a right that hasn't really been even explored in Montana law, but it's broad, and I think it could be used to expand a lot of other rights, so that's probably going to be under attack. Article 5 gives the legislature, I think Article 5, if there's a new Article 5 in the new Constitution, it'll give the legislature a lot more power than it already has, especially over the courts and especially over elections. Probably allows greater gerrymandering. And then there's a little surprise going to be for everyone, I think, after the next session of the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's going to be a case called Moore versus Harper, which considers the theory of independent state legislatures. And we're going to mention some more of that, about that, in the symposium topic after lunch tomorrow, so I'm going to leave that for that. Article 9, section 1 of this is imposes mandatory requirements on the legislature to not only to maintain, but to improve the environment. Since when have you seen the legislature in the last 2 decades ever pass legislature to improve the environment? Hasn't happened. That'll get challenged. Article 10 is the education provision. Constant fight over between the courts and the legislature about the adequate funding of K through 12, which is a mandatory requirement of the legislature to do. That'll probably get amended some way. It imposes requirements for education about Native American cultural heritage and cultural integrity. That's probably going to be under attack, and I'm sure Senator Morgan will talk about that. There's Section 9 that deals with the Board of Regents. The Board of Regents has pretty much ultimate control, with the exception of budgeting, ultimate control over the university systems. Excuse me. Constant fight between the Board of Regents and the legislature. And every time this gets litigated and it goes to the Supreme Court says, no, you don't have the power to tell the Board of Regents what to do. So, but they're going to have fun with that one, I'm sure. Article 13, my guess is they probably dumped the Consumer Council. And then Article 14, excuse me, they'll probably dump the supermajority requirement to call a constitutional convention. And as I've said already, they've pretty much destroyed the right of citizens to use the initiative process to amend the Constitution. And that, in my view, just has to be challenged in court. So, what's my vision of the Constitution going forward for the next 50 years?
Justice, could I actually come back to you at the beginning of Q&A? I do want to make sure we get to Shane.
Sure.
Okay. Senator Morgeau.
Quick.
It's always so hard to go after the Justice Nelson here, and I think when I got asked to be on the panel, I was kind of warned, we're going to be pretty critical of the legislature. But fortunately, most of those things he's talked about, myself and my colleague in the audience have opposed a lot of those efforts to diminish our Constitution and try and maintain a balance with our judiciary, our in the legislative branch and the executive branch as the Constitution calls for. I just want to say that I'm really grateful to be here and sit on this panel with so many great people who've worked very hard. I want to say I love Butte, and I love the story about Butte. I love my Butte colleagues in the legislature. And I have a feeling the gaming issue still hasn't changed a whole lot in Butte. So, based on the legislation that's came forward over the years, but I want to, honestly, I want to say that we can have a lot of philosophical and academic debates on who has the most power, whether it's the executive, the legislative branch, judicial branch. We can really do that all day, but in reality, as progressive and as good as our Constitution is, it was really truly written by colonist perspectives without input from our original inhabitants of Montana. And I say that with the utmost respect to all the people who worked on the Constitution, or worked at all of our delegates that worked on our Constitution. I think it's a great document. I just think it really missed that perspective. And certainly and clearly, as you can see on the panel, there is a lot of good people that participate in that convention process. But, that's no substitute, in no way is a substitute for the lives of natives in the state and the perspectives that should have been included in that process. And we see that impact today. We see the struggle and the lack of that representation in our Constitution, in our U.S. Constitution and our state Constitution, when we see natives ranking at the bottom of every social indicator. The highest infant mortality rates. We die on average 20 years younger than non-Indians in this country and in the state. We have the highest missing and murder rates in the country, highest diabetes rates, highest unemployment. I can go on and on. And from my experience in the political process, natives are often just an afterthought in that process. And it was an eye-opening experience for me when I was in my second term in the legislature, when I was in the House. I was trying to persuade a senator from the Kalispell area. I won't say who it is, but they're in the Flathead area. And I was trying to persuade this individual to support funding for students at tribal colleges, specifically non-Indian students that attend our tribal colleges. And then also I was trying to persuade this person to support Indian language funding in the state of Montana, which I think is part of our obligation under Article 10 that Justice Nelson just mentioned. And the senator just looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Why don't you people just get your own funding?" And so for me, when I think about like what we need in the state of Montana, although it's been long recognized for not long enough, but that natives are American citizens and state citizens and members of their tribes, it still seems very often from my perspective and experience in the legislature that we are kind of seen as separate when we're in the legislature, even though we're there as elected officials, represented as in districts throughout the state of Montana and counties throughout the state of Montana. So, I think it's a fine Constitution, but I don't think it does enough to improve on the lives of our original inhabitants. And based on a colonial socially economic system. And, really, the U.S. Constitution and the state constitution, in my opinion, are really based on extrapolating native resources. And it's one of the primary purposes of the U.S. Constitution and the state constitution is to really perpetuate wealth at the cost of other people. And I think a lot of that happened off the backs of Native people and minority people, people of color across the country, but especially indigenous peoples and lands throughout the state of Montana. And I think that's, again, you can look at the indicators that I just mentioned. But you can also look at, when we talk about the history with the copper mines, and you look at the resources that were taken and shipped out of Montana, billions of dollars was shipped out of Montana. People became extremely wealthy. You read stories still about the copper barons and the family wealth that still exists to this day. And you think about, all the resources that were taken from Native people in the state of Montana, and some of that has been litigated. In some instances, we've had to litigate to get fair market value for a lot of those takings and those damages. But most of the time, that fair market value is at the time it happened. So, early 1900s, which, as people spend their billions of dollars and continue to get wealthy off of those resources, Native peoples in the state are living off of the early 1900s, 1800 values of what those takings were. So, I think when we think at I surely hope we don't experience the changes or experience some of those changes that Honorable Nelson just talked about, because those are very, it's terrible to think about, but I think it's also very possible that we see that, and I think we do need to have a sense of urgency, and I think people need to be a lot more engaged, because there's a lot of change possibly to come, and it's going to be very damaging. But one thing that I do think we really need to consider if we do add an amendment to our state constitution is we need to think about adding an office of governor, permanent office for governing Indian affairs in the state of Montana. My experience has been that our directors, the current director is fantastic, Misty Cool. I worked with numerous directors. Jason Smith was the last director. He was wonderful. And unfortunately, though, they're often understaffed, have no staff. And, the fact that we have millions of acres of Indian lands in the state of Montana, 8 territories, 12 tribes throughout the state of Montana, pumping billions of dollars throughout the state and into the economy. Yet we still have that very limited representation in the state executive branch and in the state government. And so I think the Constitution should be mandating an office of Indian Affairs that requires staffing and a cabinet, just like any other agency, to be able to bring forth legislation like agencies do. And I think they should be overseeing those relations and interactions with our Montana Indians community. I think I don't need to really go into too much more into Justice Nelson just talked about the education piece that we have recognized under Article 10, the state's obligation to recognize the distinct and unique cultural heritage of the American Indians, and is committed to its educational goals to the preservation of their cultural integrity. What we see oftentimes is one of the Indian caucus members often explained it this way, that they feel like it's like dogs getting scraps in the legislative process when the Native Indian caucus asked for resources for education, for language preservation, to meet that obligation under Article 10. We see that also when we ask for funding for programs that bring economic development opportunities in those communities, in Montana communities across the state as well. So my takeaway on that would be, if we had an amendment of some sort, we would want to mandate curriculum to have some more consistency, certain time amounts allotted for that curriculum in our educational system. And interestingly, I sit on an educational committee. We met yesterday to talk about the Constitution and the future of our education in Montana. And I think we all recognize, I think a report just came out 2 days ago saying that I think around 54% of our students were not proficient or reading at the level that they should in our educational system, which which is very, like, when you sit in this committee and you start to see all the metrics and you see that we're behind in across the world, it's very disturbing, and the alarm bells should be going off, in not only in Montana but across the country. So I think one other thing that I think is worth mentioning is under Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution. Right now we're doing our redistricting process. Under that process, the Constitution specifically says that no district plan or proposal for a plan is acceptable if it affords members of a racial or language minority group less opportunity than other members of the electorate to participate in the political process and to elect representatives of their choice. I truly believe that that's already right at this current moment on the possible chopping block, and I think that's something that I hope Montanans are paying attention to. And ultimately, if maps are adopted that don't enhance those or meet the criteria under Article 2, Section 4, there will certainly be litigation over that section of our Constitution. Lastly, I'll just say I want to leave with this. Two thoughts. I recently had a debate with a close friend of mine about our country, and my and actually it was over a post that I had posted on social media, and they're like, do you really think we're the greatest country in the world? And I grew up in a rural community in Ronan, and I'm very patriotic. I come from a family that is, my great uncle was part of the flag raising at Iwo Jima, so my family is just very, very patriotic. And of course, my position is, yeah, absolutely. We got the greatest military in this country or in the world. We're pretty good at everything. Education, healthcare, and they're kind of looking at me like, really? You think we're the greatest in healthcare and education? Think of all the historical damages to indigenous communities. The where we're trending in education, we're behind countries like Taiwan, and well behind Taiwan and China and Canada. And so, it really got me thinking. And my final response to them was, well, if we actually follow our Constitution, both the U.S. Constitution, the state Constitution, the blueprints, and we apply it equally, yes, we are the greatest country in the world. And so with that, I'll stop talking and hand it back over to Robert.
Thanks, Senator. I know we are approaching the end of our session, but I do want to go back to Justice Nelson, who had one more topic he wanted to cover, which I think will be kind of a great capstone to this session, and then perhaps just give each of the other panelists an opportunity in just, say, a minute, Maynan, to give any closing remarks that they might have based on all the ground we've covered. Justice.
Thank you. When I talk to people about the Constitution and, as I say, the lack of knowledge of the Constitution, I do a couple of things. First, I ask them to get a copy of the Constitution. You can get them free from the Secretary of State's office. Get a copy of the Constitution and read it. You can probably read it in an hour and a half, 2 hours, and find out what's in it. And then I ask people to do this. There's the old the phrase that John Kennedy said that we all know: don't ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And I kind of turn that around. I say, don't ask what you can do for your Constitution. Ask what your Constitution can do for you. Find a provision or a couple of provisions in the Constitution that are important to you, and make that part of your personal vision of how the Constitution should operate for you. If it's, maybe you're concerned about voting rights or privacy rights or education, those sorts of things. Find out what the Constitution says. And then when you go to candidate forums and you hear candidates speak and you meet people at the door when they're campaigning, ask them about what they're going to do about that particular part of the Constitution. And I would bet you a nickel that most of these people wouldn't have a clue about what you're talking about. So put them on the defensive. This is what the Constitution says about this. Are you going to support this when you get in the legislature or not? If you're going to be a judge, are you going to uphold this provision of the Constitution? Or are you not? And don't accept some BS answer that you get from politicians. You know, you ask question A, they answer question C. That's nuts. Put them on point. Just drill it into them and find out what they think. Make them sweat. But make the Constitution part of your personal vision about how you want our state and our country to operate. Make it part of you. Read it, use it. It's your Constitution. Democracy is not a spectator sport. And unless we all get involved in it, we're going to lose it.
Thanks, Justice. Chuck, any final thoughts?
I want to apologize for skipping over a page in my presentation, and it's a very important one. There were 19 women elected to the 1972 Constitutional Convention. 19%. Doesn't seem like too many. The previous legislative session had exactly 2 out of 154 legislators. Dorothy Bradley, a freshman in the House, and Tony Rozelle, a veteran Republican legislator from Billings. Now I believe the proportion of women in the legislature is about 36-37%. Better than it used to be, but I think the population of Montana shows about 51% women. So women are still underrepresented, but far better represented than they were before the CON-CON.
Ming-Ann?
I'm just going to stay seated, and I'm not going to say much, but what I will recall is I would be up debating on the floor, and I'd see a page coming to my desk with a little yellow note from President Graybill saying, "Mrs. Robinson, it's time to wrap it up."
Rick?
Well, constitutions don't implement themselves, and they don't protect themselves. I happen to think there are a lot of real issues Montana and the rest of the country are facing. I think there are a lot of things that need to change in Montana. I don't think the Constitution is one of them.
Shane?
I almost got up and went to the podium because the microphone was taller than me when I was sitting down here. But, you know, I want to say, you know, I think maybe a little bit critical of the convention itself and the lack of representation of Native representation at the as a delegate. But, you know, I know how hard they worked. I know what that feeling is like when you have 60 days. We have 90 days in the legislature. You come out of there. Oftentimes, I look in the mirror and I feel like I'm a ghost, like my soul is being sucked out of me. And it's always interesting to get out of the session and people get back to normal life, and you're like, oh, you have color back in your skin now. So I know what that experience must. I can't speak to the very experience you went through, but I know and can guess as to how hard you all worked. And so I just want to thank all of our delegates for the work that they put in at the convention and the great document they came up with. And I hope people really take the concerns that Justice Nelson has shared with us today to heart, because I think there's a lot of scary things that can happen if we don't step up and protect our Constitution in Montana.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you to the Law Review for hosting this event. I would remind you that there is a full slate of events tomorrow that I encourage you to attend. It looks great. I suspect that our panelists might also be open to sticking around and chatting after the session. So I wish we'd had more time for questions from the audience, but I suspect you might be able to come up and chat with them now if you're interested. Please help me one more time to give thanks to our great panel tonight.
you.